Hello, everyone. My name is Karen. This is John, and this is Grant, and we're all invasive plant interns here in Augusta for the Maine Natural Areas program, and we work with the state invasive plant biologist, Chad Hammer. Today, we'll teach everyone a little bit about invasive plant identification here in Maine.
And the things that you will learn today are how to identify 20 widespread invasive plant species, how to identify 6 localized plant species, how to ID 4 early detection rapid response species, and how to distinguish invasive plants from their native lookalikes.
And finally, before we get into specific species, here are some great resources you can use either in the field or back in the office in order to identify invasive species. Starting with Native Plant Trust Go Botany, it's a great online resource with some really good photos and descriptions of key features of plants that you can use before you go into the field or to identify collected specimens. iNaturalist and Seek are owned by the same parent company, and they're two great programs as well too. Both of them work by submitting photos and getting those verified by experts, although Seek also has a camera that you can use in-app that allow you to take pictures and it'll try to figure out what plant you're looking at. If you can't get the specific species, it's usually great at getting the family. And then additionally, Maine Natural Areas program has our own field guide. It's also got some great photos, some treatment plans, habitat growth habits, and then also just some general information about plants that's really helpful for ID. And within that field guide, we've broken up each invasive species into 3 categories, depending on how invasive those are, how widespread they are, and the capacity to do damage to the environment.
Hi, everyone. I'm John, and I will be talking to you about some of the widespread invasive plants that we have here in Maine. So let's dive right in. So the first one is Asiatic bittersweet. I mentioned that even if you don't know it by its name, you've probably seen it around since it's a severely invasive vine. It's very common on roadsides and forest edges, and it competes for sunlight and can form these really dense mats around other plants. So the leaves are simple, alternate, with these weakly toothed edges, meaning if you put your finger around the edges, you'll feel some serration or indentation. And as you can see in this photo, the leaves can sometimes be wavy as well. The fruits are really bright red, and they are encapsulated by these orange husks. If you dig it up, it has bright orange roots. And also, it forms flower clusters along the leaf axils. So the axil is a section between the base of a leaf stem and the stem or branch that it grows from. It's also worth mentioning that we also have native bittersweet, very aptly called American bittersweet. And it's pretty easy to distinguish them apart since the American bittersweet really doesn't have those rounded leaves that you see on the invasive bittersweet. Instead, it has longer leaves and also only has flowers and fruits at the vine tips. So here's a photo that we took out in the field, and it really demonstrates that the leaves can look different when the plant is older. So there's a more typical bittersweet leaf that's pretty large and rounded. And here's another one that really shows that variation that's lens-shaped and more pointy. Okay, so next up we have multiflora rose, which really grows in disturbed areas which have open canopy gaps, and it's also been seen a lot in ditches. It's a very invasive shrub and can grow what are called arching canes that can climb other plants. That just really helps it quickly take over. The most defining ID feature, especially when comparing it to other roses and plants, is that it has these fringe stipules that you can see in these photos. So stipules are these leaf appendages that typically grow along the stem next to the leaves. And it also has recurved thorns, meaning that they don't grow straight out, but they're sort of bent. And it also has small rose hips, about 1/4 of an inch that you can see in this photo. And the flowers are white to very pale pink. And it's important to note that none of our native roses have white flowers, so it's very unlikely that you will confuse it with a native rose, at least by looking at the flower. So here's just a quick stipule comparison of rose species in Maine. So the bottom ones are the native ones, which are fused together. And then in this photo, you can see the fringe stipules, which is unique to multiflora rose. Next up, we've got rugosa rose, which is really common to see around beaches and coastal areas. And many people don't know that it's an invasive, so they just grow it thinking it's native ornamental plant. The leaflets are serrated and they're very heavily veined and wrinkled. So rugose or rugosa just means wrinkled. And if you put it in between your fingers, it has almost like this leathery quality. In this photo, you can see the densely prickled stems, and also the rose hips are about 1 inch wide, so slightly larger than multiflora rose. Okay, so onto our trees. This is Norway maple, which is a large deciduous tree that can grow up to 60 feet tall with a dense canopy, and it also has that yellow fall foliage, just like the native sugar maple. And it thrives in forest edges, and open areas due to its shade tolerance. It was introduced from Europe in the 1700s. It became a popular ornamental tree, and it produces a large number of seeds, which contribute to its invasive nature. Its leaves are opposite. It can be 5 to 7 lobed with pointed tips. And if you take the petiole, so the petiole is the stem that connects to the leaf, and you break that apart, you will see white sap oozing from it, which distinguishes it from native maples, which have clear sap. It also has furrowed dark gray bark, unlike the native maples. In the next slide, you'll see a good comparison of those barks. So also the flowers are tiny and yellow-green, which bloom in early spring. And also there are the samaras, which are the fruits. So that's just a typical maple samara, and it has a very wide angle. Also, there is a cultivar called the Crimson King, which has this distinctive purple-red color. So here are some of the comparison between the sugar maple, which is native lookalike. It has these brown pointed buds. The samaras have this downward bend, and it has clear petiole sap. These are all for the sugar maple. The leaves of Norway maple are also slightly larger. And then again, there is that distinguishing feature, which is petiole. So the Norway maples, when broken, will ooze white sap, whereas the sugar maples is clear. Okay, so this is shrubby honeysuckle. It's a perennial group of invasive shrubs that you have seen probably growing around or along the side of the road. It thrives in the sun, but will also invade forest understories as well. Its leaves are opposite and oval to lanceolate. And also the leaves, are, in addition to being entire, may have hairs underneath, so it contributes to having this almost fuzzy quality when you touch the leaves. The flowers are tubular, also at the leaf axils, and it has these large twigs that have hollow pits, especially in the second year growth. So it is a perennial. So you might not see it so much in the first year growth, but in the larger twigs, which are the second year growth, they will have hollow pits. And it also bears small red or orange berries, which are sort of rounded. Here are some of the native lookalikes. So there is fly honeysuckle, which is this blue one here, which produces these blue berries. And there's also mountain honeysuckle, which produces these sort of more lance-shaped or oblong-shaped berries, which typically grow in pairs. That's mountain honeysuckle. And again, the native ones have solid pith. They are smaller in height. They have different colored fruit, and they have hairs more on the margins of the leaf instead of the underside. Next up, we have autumn olive. So this is a very invasive perennial shrub. It grows in disturbed areas, in fields and roadsides as well. And it can reach 10 to 15 feet tall and wide. So autumn olive has bark with noticeable lenticels, which are these small horizontal markings. And its leaves are alternate, which can be oval to lanceolate, with a silvery or white underside due to these dense scales that appear. And the leaf edges are entire, but they may appear sort of crinkly or wavy. Autumn olive has small, fragrant, sort of yellowish white flowers that bloom in clusters. And the fruit is small, round, and it's this red berry that's speckled with silver, which ripens in late summer to fall. So Beb willow is easily recognizable by the dense hairs that it has on its new leaves. This is a native lookalike. It lacks the scales that autumn olive has, and the leaves are green on top and pale with a slightly hairy underside. In addition, this plant features a distinct spike-shaped inflorescence, which you can see here. This is Japanese barberry, which is a perennial deciduous shrub that typically grows up to 6 feet tall and wide. It can be smaller, typically, though, as well. It has distinctive, about 1/3 of an inch long spines at the leaf axils. The leaves are alternate, rounded, and they're sort of tapered at the base. You can see in this photo. And they turn vibrant red in the fall. So the shrub produces small yellow flowers and bright red fruits that hang below the stem, which make it easily recognizable. You can find it in forest, fields, and along roadsides as well. So this is the photo that we took earlier in the season while out in the field, and you can see that the Japanese barberry is taking advantage of the sunlight, which is due to an open canopy gap since trees had recently fallen. All right, next up, we've got European barberry. It's a deciduous shrub that reaches up to 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide. Its leaves are oval, tapered at the base as well. It has serrated margins, and this shrub produces these really striking yellow flowers and red oblong fruits that hang below the stem. In addition to that, the stems have 2 to 3 parted spines at each node. And interestingly, this is the least common of the two barberries, which is a good thing. So this is glossy buckthorn. Unlike the common buckthorn, which you'll see in the next slide, glossy buckthorn lacks wooden thorns. Its leaves are alternate, glossy, and have entire or sort of smooth edges. So the leaf venation sort of radiates outwards from the mid-vein, which create these really distinctive patterns that you can see in this photo. So the fruits of the glossy buckthorn change color as they mature. They start red and then turn to purple-black. And this plant can be found in wetlands and other moist environments, which make it a frequent sighting in such areas. And really identifying it by its glossy leaves and the absence of thorns can help you distinguish it from other buckthorn species. So this is common buckthorn. It's a perennial deciduous shrub or small tree, which can grow up to 25 feet in height. This plant is very shade tolerant, and it thrives in both moist and well-drained soils, and it's capable of growing and reproducing under a full canopy. It often features multiple stems at the base, and the leaves are simple to subopposite, so it's just sort of somewhere in between being opposite and alternate. And they are also toothed, so they range in shape from elliptical to almost round and have pointed tips, and they stay green late into the fall. So the bark is shiny gray with light-colored lenticels, almost scaly, and it has orange inner bark on older growth. Also in June, small white-green 4-petal flowers appear in clusters at the leaf bases along the stems. And by late summer, around 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch wide fruits mature from green to glossy black, with clusters of black fruit ripening on plants in August and September. So this plant does have a native lookalike, which is common buckthorn. This is alderleaf buckthorn, which has 5 to 8 pairs of parallel leaf veins, which make it quite distinct. It's a low shrub, so typically growing under less than 4 feet tall, and it's only found in wetlands. And unlike common buckthorn, it lacks thorns. So if you see a thornless shrub in a wetland area and it matches this description, it could potentially be alder-leafed buckthorn. All right, it's time for a break.
All right, welcome back from the break. My name is Grant, and I'll finish up with the rest of our widespread species. Starting with burning bush. This is a really common understory invader. It's going to be something that's going to be on your field edges. It's extremely shade tolerant and can germinate in full shade as well, and is tolerant of moist soils as well. It's going to be a perennial deciduous shrub with broad branching structures and around up to 15 feet tall, so it can grow quite robust. The leaf structure is going to be something reminiscent of honeysuckle. They're going to be simple, opposite, usually 1 to 2 inch long leaves. But what's going to separate this from honeysuckle is a really fine tooth leaf structure around the edge margins. It's also, these leaves are going to get a really vivid red fall color, so it's going to make it easy to identify as the rest of our plants lose their leaves around that time of year. And then the stems really frequently have corky wings that are coming off of it. This is a growth structure and habit you really won't see with any other understory invaders or plants, period, in Maine. So you can use that to help identify it out in the field. Sometimes you'll see much stronger and defined cork structures like you see in this bottom left image, or you'll see something that's much more compact to the plant and a smaller four-sided cork structure as well. Moving on, we've got black swallowwort. This is going to be a perennial vine growing up to 6 feet tall, so very, very long, with opposite lance to heart-shaped leaves that turn yellow in the fall. And so it's going to be really distinguishing about this vine here is the 6 to 10 5-pointed dark purple flowers that are going to come out at each leaf axil. And those flowers are going to develop into 1 to 3 inch long green pods. Both the flowers and the green pods are really distinct to this vine, and you're not going to see really any other climbing vine in Maine with those structures on it. The stems themselves are going to have really fine hairs as well. This will be a plant to look out for because as it's not extremely common in Maine, it's very widespread across southern New England and has a potential to really come in. And as you can see in the bottom left here of this image, just completely take over any climbing structure whatsoever and kill anything else that's growing beneath it. There's also pale swallowwort that is extremely similar to black swallowwort, the only main difference here being the color of those flowering structures as well. So you're going to see a much paler pink purple rather than that dark rich purple that you might see on black swallowwort. And as you can see on this slide too, those seed pods in the left here are really distinct. You won't see any other structure like that on any of our climbing vines and can help identify it, especially during this time of year when those seed pods are actually present. So moving on to common reed, also commonly known as Phragmites or simply frag. This is a 6 to 13 foot tall perennial grass, really exclusive to wetlands, drainage areas, just areas, especially just on the side of roads with drainage, with water and disturbed soils as well. You're gonna see long alternative blue to green leaves that are widest in the middle, and then those large seed heads that are consist long into the winter on those very tan, thin stalks, as you can see there. And then those stems are going to be hollow with pretty distinct nodes as well. So what's going to be very hard about frag is telling it apart from its Native American reed. So both these species look near identical, but the first thing I'd look for to differentiate them in the field would just be the growth habit and how the plants are existing in their environment. So something like your invasive Phragmites is going to grow in a massive monoculture, a very large stand, and it's also going to grow above 6 feet. The Native American reed is not going to grow in a similar manner. It's going to be almost completely reserved to wetlands and not into the roadside ditches or culverts or any drainage areas like our invasive Phragmites. And then I'd look for the inflorescence head as well. So something like our invasive Phragmites, you're going to see a much more robust, much more distinct head that's going to come out of the species here versus something like our Native American reed is you're going to see a much smaller inflorescence at the top of that plant there. And then additionally, looking at the stem, you're not going to see any of the red like you'd see here at the American reed with our invasive Phragmites. So the invasive Phragmites, as you can see in the left here, very tan with that node in the middle right there, and you're not going to see nearly any of that red coloration as well. But like I said, one of the easiest ways to tell these two plants apart would just be the growing habit. Invasive Phragmites is going to be over 6 feet, often in monoculture, and is going to extend its habitat beyond just wetlands, but into those drainage areas, into the side of the road there. Reed canary grass is going to be a very similar species of common reed in terms of trying to tell it apart with its native strain as well. So reed canary grass is going to be robust perennial grass around 2 to 6 feet in height, commonly around 4 feet. You won't see it usually get up to that 6 feet range. And those leaves are going to be alternate flat with a rough texture like a lot of our grasses and 45 degrees as well. So these plants are going to have a 1/4 inch ligule that usually occurs where the lead sheath meets the stem, as you can see in this bottom left image. And I'll show you in the next slide how that's going to help differentiate it from its native variety as well. So here pictured as our native variety, we have blue joint grass, but I must make a note here. Reed canary grass does have a native strain as well. That's extremely hard to differentiate the two, but something like our common reed, again, you're gonna look at the growth pattern. If it's growing in a monoculture, quite robust, you can lean towards identifying it as an invasive, whereas something like our more native plants are not gonna grow in a monoculture nearly to the same extent. And then one thing with the reed canary grass I would look for is that native variety is going to have a much thinner leaf. It's not going to be nearly as robust as our invasive reed canary grass. It has a much thicker leaf coming off the stem. And so differentiating from blue joint grass, you're usually going to go along those same lines. Look for the growth habit. If it's growing in a multiculture, if it's growing like a invasive, then you know it's probably invasive and it's probably a part of those monocultures. Meanwhile, blue joint grass is going to have a much peelier, tanner, flaky ligule than something you'd see with our invasive. And it's also going to have narrow inflorescence, narrow leaves, and narrow stems as well. So moving on, we've got purple loosestrife. That's going to be a super common marshland invader. You'll see it once it finds any sort of well-drained, wet soil. It can completely take those areas over. It's an upright, hardy perennial, up to 6 feet tall, so quite robust, and its leaves are opposite or whorled, meaning they're going to come out of the same node in the leaf. You can see here coming off that stem, you see one leaf here, and they're coming out of the same node. And it's either going to be opposite or whorled. So instead of 2 leaves, you might see 3 coming out of the top as well. And they're also going to be sessile, meaning they don't have any petiole. They're not going to have any stem connecting the base of the leaf to the main stem of the plant. It's just going to be fused right there. And then also what's really distinct about these plants is they've got a 4-sided stem. So that's going to differentiate it from any of its native varieties. So comparing it to its native varieties, we're going to look at fireweed. Fireweed has a round stem. It's not going to have that 4-sided stem. So if you're out in the field and you roll that stem across your fingers, you can differentiate those by the shape of them. You're also going to look at the leaf structure. Fireweed has alternate leaves, so it's not going to have that really distinct whorled or opposite leaf pattern. And then also looking at its flowers, you're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4 petals here and 4 sepals around those petals. Whereas something like our invasive purple loosestrife, you're going to see 5 to 7 flowers, and that's going to really differentiate these two species. However, that being said, both of these plants do have spears of flowers coming at the top of them that do flower asynchronously, meaning they start flowering at the bottom and then will move their way up to the top, which can make them hard to tell apart. But like I said, look for that stem. That's the first thing I'd look for. And you can use that to help differentiate them. And then looking at the size and petal count as well. That's going to help differentiate these two species. Moving on, we've got garlic mustard. This is going to be a biennial herb. It's going to be something that can really overtake understory, moving in from field edges and taking over any disturbed soil areas. So as a biennial herb, it's going to have 2 really distinct stages of growth. The first stage is going to be a basal rosette where it's tight to the ground. It's going to have really fine, coarse, rounded teeth, as you can see in that top image, going around the edge there. And the base of that leaf is going to curl and extend around where the petiole meets it. And that's going to be pretty distinct in terms of ground cover. And then those basal rosettes are going to have a really distinct vein pattern as well, like a watermark on top of it. And then as we move into second year growth, you're going to have a shoot coming up for flowering. And so that shoot is going to come up to the top and produce 4-petaled small white flowers. And as it's growing, those leaves are going to become much more triangular rather than kidney bean shaped. And instead of short, coarse, round teeth, they're going to develop and taper into much longer points. And that's going to be really distinct. So telling it apart from wild violets would be our native lookalike here. So native violets, they're going to cover the ground in a similar manner. It's not going to be complete but basal rosettes. So they're not all going to come out of one node. And they're going to have really distinct inflorescences between the two. The teeth pattern can be slightly similar, with native violets being not nearly just finely toothed. But the easiest way to tell these two species apart is garlic mustard, like the name implies, has a really distinct smell if you crush and damage those leaf cells. So you take some of those basal leaves and rosettes, and you roll them around your hands, and you crush it up, you'll really smell garlic quickly. The older leaves sort of start to lose the concentration of this, so they won't smell as distinct. But in terms of basal rosette, which is the hardest time to tell this plant apart from its native variety, just crush those leaves and it will really tell you and help you distinguish against any of our native species. So moving on to black locust. This is one of our invasive trees. It's going to have compound leaves coming out. So you're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4, and this whole structure here is considered one compound leaf. And those compound leaves are going to come out in opposite right here. They're also going to be entire margins, so smooth leaf edges, no teeth there. And it's going to have a lighter underside as well. These are going to have classic pea flowers up here as well. It's going to be distinct to this plant. And it's also going to have really interesting spines coming off these trunks. And these spines are going to come off in pairs of 1 and 2. You may think of honey locust when you think of spines coming off, but honey locust is going to have much more complex sort of bundles of spine that are going to come off the tree. And this tree really is going to outshade and outcompete any of our native trees and be quite damaging to a lot of our forest stock that way. So moving on to privets, this is commonly mistaken as some of our honeysuckle, but there are some great ways to help tell plants apart. There's going to be a shrub going up to 15 feet tall and wide. It's going to have opposite oval or lance-shaped leaves that are entire, so no teeth on those leaves, and 2 inches long. And then the flower structure, you're going to see white clusters of tube flowers coming off of leaf ends and leaf axils. And additionally, the fruit are going to be round, green, and ripen to bluish, dark black in sort of these clusters. And that's going to be something that really helps differentiate it from any honeysuckle. So you can see that flowering structure and that fruiting structure is pretty distinct to this plant. But again, this is going to take over any areas similar to our buckthorns or our honeysuckle, where it's going to move from disturbed areas of sunlight, sort of forest edges, field edges, and then move in and creep in and take over that understory as well. And then next, we've got Japanese knotweed. If you ever dealt with invasives, you're probably familiar with this plant, or if you've driven around Maine, you're also probably familiar with this plant everywhere. It is extremely widespread and extremely common due to a couple of reasons. It reproduces rhizomally, so any stem fragments are going to break off and reproduce. And so if a large storm comes in and moves a lot of those stem fragments away, it's going to reroot and take over another area. Additionally, this is an extremely proficient grower at almost 8 inches a day, which can make it extremely hard to deal with. And once it's in your forest stock, it's very, very difficult to remove. It's going to be robust, very tall, up to 10 feet even. It's going to be a perennial herb growing in dense stands. And you'll see a lot of those stem fragments that are gray and dark and tan, usually a little bit brown as well, over winter as well, as those leaves die off. The leaves are going to be simple, alternate, flat, and entire. You're going to see a flat base, which is going to help differentiate it from our giant knotweed next. And then those stems are going to be extremely distinct. They're going to be 1 to 2 inches diameter, so quite thick, round and hollow, with nodes where the leaves are coming out. And this can make it very hard to distinguish, or commonly distinguished as bamboo. But bamboo, which is also invasive, is not nearly as common as Japanese knotweed across the state of Maine. Japanese knotweed luckily cannot reproduce through pollination. It's just through those rhizomes. So it's very commonly spread through fill. But like I said, if this plant does reach a forest stock, it can completely take it over, enjoys well-drained wet soil, but can take over a wide variety of it as well. So it is time for a break.
Hello again, it's Karen, and now we are on to more localized species, which we'll go over 6 today. Our first one is giant knotweed. It's quite similar to Japanese knotweed, just it's very big. It can grow up to 12 feet tall. This is a perennial that grows in dense stands, and it's very shade intolerant. The leaves are 6 to 12 inches long with a heart-shaped base and tapered leaf tips, which you can very differentiate this from the Japanese knotweed because Japanese knotweed leaves have that straight base. But they also grow small white flowers and spikes along stems, and they flower in late summer. And stems are 1 to 2 inches in diameter and hollow with swollen nodes. The stems turn brown to red and they persist through the winter. Giant knotweed can also hybridize with Japanese knotweed, which is then called Bohemian knotweed, which is also very invasive. Now we are onto giant hogweed. This plant comes with a warning because the sap can cause severe dermatitis when the skin is exposed to the sun. So please practice caution, especially because the native lookalike also causes burns. Not as severe though. But this plant can grow up to 15 feet tall and requires 3 to 5 years to flower before they then die and can spread up to 100,000 seeds. The leaves are alternate, up to 5 feet wide, and are deeply toothed and lobed, as you can see in the bottom right. They have umbels of small white flowers that can be up to 2.5 feet across. And the stem is quite rigid, with rough hairs and purple splotches, which you can see on the next slide. Now we have cow's parsnip, which is the native lookalike for giant hogweed. Still exercise caution because this can cause mild rash or burns if the sap on your skin gets exposed to the sun. But this plant is much shorter than giant hogweed, has smaller leaves, though they are wider. They're less toothed and less lobed than hogweed, as you can see in the bottom here. There are quite drastic differences in the leaves. They have smaller umbels of white flowers, usually a half-foot wide, and stalks are mostly green with softer hairs and not showing a lot of purple spots, as you can see up at the top. Now, ornamental jewelweed. This is an annual that prefers moist soils. It's quite common along river and stream shores, but it can grow in a wide range of soil types and even at higher elevations. They can grow up to 6.5 feet tall. They have a hollow and smooth stem, and they have 1 to 2 inch large pink flowers. The leaves are simple and 2 to 9 inches long with serrated edges, and they are opposite or even sometimes in whorls of 3. So the lookalikes for ornamental jewelweed are spotted jewelweed, which is seen on the top right, and then pale jewelweed seen on the top left. So these lookalikes are quite smaller. They have alternating oval leaves with much softer venation than the very pointed serration ornamental jewelweed. And of course, they have orange and yellow flowers, which is quite different than the purple and pink flowers of ornamental jewelweed. Bishop's goutweed, or just goutweed. It arrived here as an ornamental, and you'll see it usually planted as a ground cover in gardens, but it obviously spreads farther than gardens. It's perennial and can grow up to 2 feet tall. They have quite complicated compound leaves that are serrated and triternate, which triternate means that the petiole separates into 3, in which each 3 has 3 leaflets on them, which you can kind of see at the top. But the wild type of goutweed has green leaves, and then the variegated form is more of a pale bluish green color with white margins, which you can see in the bottom left. And then the right is the wild version. They have umbels of tiny white flowers on 2 to 3 foot stalks, which require at least partial sun to flower. Excuse me. Goutweed's look-alike is golden Alexander's, which has yellow flowers instead of white. But when they aren't flowering, you can also tell them apart because they have 2 to 3 times the compound leaves that the invasive goutweed has in groups of 3 to 5 leaflets. Yellow iris. Yellow iris is a wetland plant that may be in freshwater or saltwater in open or forested wetlands. So they can be about anywhere in any wetland almost. They have flat sword-like leaves that have parallel venation, which are about 1 inch wide and up to 3.5 feet long. They have thick rhizomes with black sap, and even the dry rhizomes can still be viable for months. The large yellow flowers have 3 drooping sepals with brown markings, and they grow and develop into 1 to 4 inch long seed capsules that contain these disc-shaped seeds, which you can see in the bottom left. Lesser celandine. This is a highly invasive early spring ephemeral that is present in a few locations in Maine currently, and it becomes dormant during the summer where the leaves turn yellow and die back. It can form thick mats on the forest floor where they prefer moist soils near water. And they have these kidney-shaped leaves with rounded teeth, as you can see on the bottom right. Sometimes having lighter spots on the leaves as shown. Also have tuberous roots and above ground bulbils that can be kicked around and travel in water to spread and grow more plants in new areas. So these tubers are like little potatoes, which potatoes are tubers too, but it's a storage of nutrients for the plants. You can see them in the top left photo, and then the bulbils in the top right. But they also have yellow flowers with 8 to 11 petals and 3 sepals. Its native lookalike is marsh marigold. It's very important to distinguish these because marsh marigold is a very beneficial native. They have large yellow flowers with only 5 petals, larger leaves, and they do not have the tuberous roots or bulbils. Now we are moving on to our early detection and rapid response species in Maine, which is our most important focus here at the Natural Areas program, and I'll introduce 4 of them today. But it's important to learn how to identify these more uncommon species because there are most likely more populations of them that are unknown because they might be on someone's private property who is just unfamiliar with them. But we are starting off with Japanese stiltgrass. So this is a very invasive annual grass and it's currently known to be in York, Sanford, and Georgetown, Maine, where we are helping to manage and get rid of them currently. But they grow best in moist soils and can be very shade tolerant, where they can completely cover a closed canopy forest floor. But it grows up to 3 feet tall, has stilted roots that can lift it off the ground, where the plant can kind of spread and form mats of grass. And they have alternating leaves with a silver midrib of small hairs on the upper leaf surface. But very young plants seem to not have this feature yet. Leaves seem to grow at a 45-degree angle upwards, and the plant is usually leaning over at an angle as well. And in September, they flower with 1 to 3 seed spikes, which you can see on the next slide. But here we have our native lookalike, Virginia cutgrass. They lack the silvery midrib here, and they have different inflorescences, as you can see at the top. But cutgrass also has hairy rings around the stem and small hairs all over the stem, while stiltgrass is primarily hairless, except for some hairs near the base of the leaf blades. And Virginia cutgrass also seems to grow blades straight outwards like this, instead of the leaning 45-degree angle that stiltgrass has. Perennial pepperweed. This is an invasive that can tolerate a wide range of soil types. It's known to pull salt ions from deep in the soil, bring it up to the soil surface, which can alter the soil and then also the plant diversity around them. But it can grow up to 5 feet tall when it is in flower, and it has basal leaves that can be up to 1 foot long and 3 inches wide with long petioles. The leaves along the stem are much smaller here, and they may have entire to weakly serrated margins. The leaves often feel succulent and thicker than most other leaves, and they grow clusters of small white flowers that have 4 petals. And seed pods are small and round and contain 2 seeds inside. And if you feel the base of the stem feels semi-woody usually. Tree of Heaven. This tree is very opportunistic and can grow in most areas. It can grow up to 80 feet tall with a 6-foot diameter, but they are usually much smaller than that. They have pinnately compound leaves that are 1 to 4 feet long and have 10 to 40 leaflets, which you can see here. And the leaflets have entire and smooth margins with only a few glandular teeth, which I'm circling now. That's what they call it. Near the base of the leaves. The leaves and stems are smelly when crushed. It's often described as like a rotten peanut butter smell. But the look-alike for Tree of Heaven is the lovely staghorn sumac. Sumac is different because it has toothed edges on its leaflets shown here on the right, which Tree of Heaven has smooth margins. And staghorn sumac also doesn't have that stinky smell when you crush the leaves. And it also doesn't have these unique pods seed pods that Tree of Heaven has on the left. Mile-a-minute. This is a very unique vine that favors areas with full sun, usually in moist soil. It can form dense mats that can climb and overtake other species nearby, as you can see this at the bottom left. They have alternate, very triangular leaves that are 1 to 3 inches long, as well as ochrea that surround the stem at the base of the petioles. And explain ochrea are these little circular plant structures around the stem shown in the photos here too. Their fruits ripen to blue, which birds often eat, in which they spread the seeds to new locations. The fruits can also float in the water for up to 9 days, which aids in the spread as well. Hooked barbs are also along the stems, petioles, and on the underside of the leaf veins. This is Mile-a-minute's native look-alike bindweed. They have red fruits and lack barbs, as well as lacking the round ochrea on the stems. The leaves are also not triangular like Mile-a-minute, and Mile-a-minute is just very unique, so it's hard to find a look-alike for this plant.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for viewing this video. If you have any questions, feel free to visit maine.gov/DACF/MNAP. You can go under the invasive species tab, or you can email invasives.mnap@maine.gov. And
if you ever see an invasive, you can make a free account at imapinvasives.org and upload your sightings through the app or website.
thank you.